Human beings have done something truly impressive with violence. We organized it. At some point, fighting stopped being just two angry groups throwing rocks at each other and became a scheduled activity involving commanders, formations, supply lines, specialized weapons, and eventually people whose entire job description was basically, please go stand over there and stab whoever the king dislikes. That transformation raises a surprisingly difficult question. When did humans actually invent armies? Because violence is ancient. Chimpanzees raid rival groups. Hunter-gatherers sometimes fought other communities. Prehistoric skeletons carry wounds that definitely did not come from slipping in the shower. But an army is something different. An army requires planning, hierarchy, logistics, discipline, and enough social cooperation to convince hundreds or thousands of people to risk dying beside individuals they may barely know. So the real invention wasn't killing. We were already disturbingly qualified. The invention was organized killing. Before humans could invent armies, we had to invent something much more difficult. Cooperation. That sounds harmless until you realize what cooperation actually means. Hunting together, sharing food, watching somebody else's children, remembering who owes whom a favor, following social rules, punishing freeloaders, and somehow spending several days around the same people without murdering Kevin because he ate the last roasted tuber. Humans became unusually good at this. Our ancestors survived not simply because individuals were clever, but because groups could pool information, divide labor, teach skills, share resources, and coordinate actions. Hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists often maintain extensive social networks containing both relatives and non-relatives, and cooperation can extend across hunting, childcare, food sharing, and collective decision-making. That matters enormously for warfare. One angry person can commit violence. An army requires many angry people to agree on approximately the same direction. And even before anything resembling a formal army existed, our evolutionary cousins were already demonstrating a primitive ingredient. Chimpanzees sometimes form coalitions and conduct aggressive encounters against neighboring groups. So the basic idea of several individuals cooperating against outsiders is not uniquely human. Humans simply took the concept and added project management. Our advantage was flexibility. We could coordinate larger numbers of people through language, shared identities, social obligations, alliances, and eventually rules that existed beyond immediate family relationships. Then there were weapons. Stone tools appeared millions of years before armies, and hunting technologies gradually gave hominins the ability to injure dangerous targets from farther away. Spears, thrusting weapons, and later projectile technologies were originally useful for acquiring dinner. Unfortunately, the difference between a hunting weapon and a war weapon is mostly what you pointed at. But equipment alone still does not create an army. You also need leadership. You need people willing to follow instructions when doing so is inconvenient, frightening, or potentially fatal. You need some mechanism for deciding who fights, when they fight, where everyone meets, and what happens when one warrior decides that sprinting in the opposite direction is suddenly his strongest tactical contribution. Most importantly, you need trust. A coordinated fighting group depends on each person believing that the others will remain beside them when violence begins. That kind of collective discipline rests on social abilities humans had been developing for survival long before organized warfare. So the foundations of the army were not forged on a battlefield. They were forged around camps, hunting parties, food-sharing networks, alliances, stories, obligations, and generations of increasingly sophisticated cooperation. Humans learned how to act together first. Only later did someone realize that teamwork could have a much sharper application. The first wars probably did not begin because somebody woke up one morning and announced, "Gentlemen, I have invented geopolitics." They were more likely smaller, messier, and much more personal. A hunting party crosses into another group's territory. Someone steals food. Someone takes livestock. A relative is killed. A feud begins. A few people decide revenge sounds reasonable. Congratulations! You now have the prehistoric version of foreign policy. Archaeology gives us disturbing glimpses of this world. At Nataruk, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, researchers uncovered the remains of hunter-gatherers who died roughly 10,000 years ago. Several skeletons showed severe traumatic injuries, including wounds consistent with projectiles and blunt force blows. One individual appears to have been struck in the head. Another had stone projectile material associated with the body. Whatever happened, there was not a polite disagreement, but calling Nataruk an army battle would be going too far. The victims may have been attacked by another mobile group, perhaps during a raid, an ambush, or a conflict over resources. Researchers still debate exactly what the site represents. That uncertainty is important because organized violence can exist long before organized armies. A dozen people attacking another dozen people is warfare in a broad sense. It is not necessarily an institution. The major transformation came when humans began accumulating things worth defending. For most mobile hunter-gatherers, wealth was limited by a brutally practical rule. If you cannot carry it, you probably do not own much of it. But as some communities became more sedentary, the equation changed. Stored grain could be stolen. Livestock could be driven away. Fields could be occupied. Water sources could be controlled. Permanent settlements could not simply pack up and disappear every time the neighbors became annoying. Agriculture did not magically invent human aggression, but it changed the economics of aggression. Suddenly, attacking another community could produce a large, concentrated reward, and defending your own community became equally important. That created pressure for walls, watch systems, alliances, retaliatory raids, and groups of people who were expected to fight on behalf of everyone else. And once communities grew larger, another possibility appeared. Instead of gathering a few relatives for revenge, a leader could gather dozens of fighters for a planned operation. Maybe they attacked at dawn. Maybe they chose targets in advance. Maybe they coordinated routes. Maybe they even trained together. At that point, violence was becoming less spontaneous and more procedural. That is the crucial transition. The army was probably not invented in a single dramatic moment. It emerged when raids became repeatable, when fighting became organized, and when communities discovered that violence could be planned like any other group project. Which sounds disturbingly modern, because eventually somebody was going to make the project much, much bigger. For most of prehistory, archaeology gives us fragments, a broken skull here, a defensive wall there, a spear point lodged somewhere a spear point absolutely should not be. Then you get Tollense. Around 1250 BCE, in what is now northeastern Germany, something enormous happened along the Tollense River. Archaeologists have recovered the remains of more than 150 individuals from the valley, many showing unmistakable signs of violent trauma, and that number is almost certainly only a fraction of the dead. Researchers have estimated that more than 2,000 people may have participated in the conflict. 2,000. That is no longer a few cousins settling a disagreement over livestock. That requires organization. The battlefield produced bronze and flint arrowheads, wooden weapons, and human remains scattered through the ancient river landscape. Many of the dead were young adult men, exactly the demographic you would expect to be heavily represented in a fighting force. But the strangest clue came from the weapons themselves. A recent analysis of arrowheads found at Tollense showed that some styles closely matched types known farther south in Central Europe. That suggests at least some of the fighters may have traveled considerable distances before arriving at the battlefield, which creates a logistical question. Why? People do not casually walk hundreds of miles carrying weapons because they heard northern Germany was lovely in October. If warriors really came from distant regions, then someone had recruited them, allied with them, paid them, persuaded them, obligated them, or gave them a reason strong enough to leave home and fight strangers beside a river. That is a very different social machine from a spontaneous raid. And Tollense was not humanity's first violent episode. Thousands of years earlier, sites such as Nadaruk and several Neolithic mass graves already demonstrate that communities could kill one another on horrifying scales. What Tollense shows is something else: scale, mobility, coordination, possibly multiple groups converging for a planned confrontation. We still cannot look at the bones and identify a general, a chain of command, or somebody's Bronze Age payroll department. Archaeology rarely gives us organizational charts. But once hundreds or thousands of combatants can appear in the same place, equipped for battle and perhaps arriving from different regions, we are moving dangerously close to something recognizable. An army. Not necessarily a permanent professional army. Not soldiers living in barracks and collecting standardized salaries. But humans had clearly learned how to assemble fighting forces far larger than the intimate social groups in which our species had evolved. And that creates an uncomfortable realization. By the Bronze Age, humans did not merely know how to fight. We knew how to mobilize. The remaining mystery was who controlled that power. Because once societies discovered how to gather thousands of armed people in one place, kings were going to become very interested. Here is the annoying part. There is no skeleton labeled first soldier. There is no cave painting saying, "This is the day we officially became an army." And archaeology is extremely bad at preserving paperwork. That makes the origin of armies surprisingly difficult to pin down, because the physical evidence for violence appears much earlier than the evidence for military institutions. A mass grave can tell us people were killed. A fortified settlement can tell us somebody expected trouble. A pile of weapons can tell us people were very committed to making sharp objects. But none of those things automatically proves there was an army. That distinction matters. Some researchers emphasize that lethal conflict between human groups may have very deep prehistoric roots. Others argue that large-scale warfare became far more common only after populations grew, settlements became permanent, and communities accumulated resources worth stealing or defending. Both positions can point to evidence, and both can be oversimplified. Take hunter-gatherers. Some groups clearly engaged in raids, ambushes, revenge killings, and territorial conflict. That tells us warfare did not require cities, kings, or agriculture. But temporary coalitions of fighters are not necessarily armies in the institutional sense. An army usually implies something more durable: command recruitment logistics, defined military roles, repeated mobilization, and eventually, some way of feeding people who are spending their afternoon fighting instead of farming. That last part is less glamorous than bronze swords, but arguably more important. 1,000 warriors are also 1,000 stomachs. Someone has to provide grain, water, animals, weapons, replacement equipment, and enough political authority to keep everyone moving toward the battlefield instead of wandering home because harvest season started. This is why some scholars connect the development of true armies with increasingly complex societies. As populations became larger and governments became better at collecting taxes, storing surplus food, organizing labor, and controlling territory, rulers gained something prehistoric raiding parties usually lacked: administrative power, the ability to turn cooperation into mobilization. But even then, the boundary remains fuzzy. Was Tollense fought by armies? Possibly. Were they permanent armies? We cannot prove that. Were the fighters recruited by chiefs, allied communities, warrior elites, or some combination of all three? Also uncertain. Archaeology can show us the battlefield. It cannot always show us the meeting where somebody said, "Everyone bring a spear. We leave Tuesday." So asking who invented the army may be the wrong question. Nobody necessarily invented it. Armies may have emerged gradually as human societies became capable of organizing more people, storing more food, controlling more territory, and maintaining violence for longer periods. The breakthrough was not a new weapon. It was bureaucracy, which is somehow less cinematic and much more dangerous. Once humans had rulers, taxes, stored grain, and enough administrators to make everyone miserable in an organized way, armies changed again. They stopped being temporary gatherings. They became institutions. Early states in Mesopotamia give us some of the clearest evidence. By the 3rd millennium BCE, cities such as Lagash and Umma were fighting over land, irrigation, and political control. These were not random village brawls. They were conflicts between organized states capable of mobilizing large groups of men, provisioning them, equipping them, and directing them under centralized authority. One famous monument, the Stele of the Vultures, shows soldiers from Lagash advancing in formation behind large shields, armed with long spears. And that image matters, because formation fighting requires discipline. If everyone simply runs toward the enemy doing whatever feels emotionally correct, you do not have a formation, you have a panic with weapons. Soldiers had to maintain spacing, move together, trust the men beside them, and respond to commands. Their effectiveness depended less on individual heroics and more on whether the group could behave like a single machine. Civilization had discovered synchronized stabbing, but armies also needed something much less dramatic: accounting. A ruler could not maintain a military force without knowing who owed labor, how much grain existed, where weapons were stored, which communities supplied recruits, and how long a campaign could continue before everybody became hungry and extremely interested in mutiny. That meant the rise of armies was deeply connected to the rise of administration. Taxes could feed soldiers, workshops could produce weapons, roads and boats could move supplies, scribes could track obligations, fortifications could protect strategic locations, commanders could coordinate forces that were far too large for every warrior to personally know the leader. And then warfare began shaping society in return. Successful rulers could seize farmland, livestock, labor, trade routes, and tribute. Those resources supported larger states, which could support larger armies, which could conquer more resources. A cheerful little feedback loop. Military service also became tied to identity and status. Warriors could become elites. Victories could be turned into monuments. Kings presented themselves as protectors, conquerors, and favorites of the gods. War was no longer merely something communities survived. It became something states used. The army now defended borders, enforced authority, collected tribute, suppressed rebellion, and expanded political power. And once rulers learned that armed organization could preserve the state itself, the army became very difficult to remove. What began as temporary cooperation during danger had transformed into permanent infrastructure. A society could now manufacture military force almost on demand, which meant war no longer had to wait for an emergency. Sometimes the army itself created the opportunity. Today, an army can contain hundreds of thousands of people connected by satellites, logistics software, aircraft, armored vehicles, medical systems, intelligence networks, and supply chains so complex that a Bronze Age commander would probably assume we had recruited gods. But underneath all of that technology is the same ancient trick. Humans coordinate. We convince large numbers of strangers to follow shared rules, accept hierarchies, trust people they have never met, and act together toward a goal. That ability gave us hunting parties, then villages, then cities, then states, and eventually armies. The strange thing is that the army was never really invented as a single object. There was no prehistoric genius who sketched a formation in the dirt and yelled, "I call this the military." Instead, armies emerged from several much older human abilities being combined. Cooperation became command, food surplus became logistics, social identity became loyalty, leadership became hierarchy, weapons became standardized equipment, and occasional raids became something societies could organize repeatedly. Once states learned how to maintain that system, warfare changed permanently. Battles could be planned months in advance. Campaigns could cross enormous distances. Soldiers could fight for rulers they had never personally met. Empires could expand because thousands of strangers had learned to move, eat, march, and kill according to the same schedule, which is both an extraordinary achievement of cooperation and a slightly terrifying sentence. Because armies reveal one of the deepest contradictions in human nature. We are capable of cooperating on scales no other species comes close to matching. That is how we build temples, cities, universities, hospitals, and spacecraft. It is also how we build invasion forces. The same social machinery that allows 10,000 people to construct something together can allow 10,000 people to destroy something together. So when you look at a modern army, you are not just looking at weapons. You are looking at millions of years of social evolution, thousands of years of political organization, and an ancient human talent for turning individual behavior into collective power. We did not become dangerous because we learned how to fight. Plenty of animals can fight. We became dangerous when we learned how to organize. Apparently, project management really was the final boss.